I wish to thank you so much for your presence here tonight. It's always encouraging for me to be able to visit with other churches and know that there are others who share my interest in the things of God. And so, for what it's worth to you, your very presence here is an encouragement to me tonight. And I'm thankful also for the opportunity to speak to you on this subject, and for the occasion it has given me, your invitation has given me, to perhaps look more deeply into Romans 13 verses 1 through 7 than I have ever looked before. So I appreciate the occasion that it has given me for that study. I spoke to Byron last night, and I might be getting him in trouble to say this, but he told me just to go until I'm finished. I have never been told that before, and I told him, Byron, you know you shouldn't tell a preacher something like that. He said, well, that's what I do. So anyway, I don't mean to scare you. I'm going to try to not to tax your patience unduly, and in the process I hope to leave with you some things that will help you in your effort to live as God would have you to live. So as I said, we're going to be looking at Romans 13 verses 1 through 7 tonight particularly, but I'm going to say some things, maybe a lot of things, relatively speaking, by way of introduction to this portion of God's Word. Start off by observing that, of course, it's Paul's typical practice, you may well know, to follow the foregoing and typically larger ideological sections of his letters with sections which are devoted to practical applications of the principles that he set forth in that foregoing section. And Romans is no exception to that. In chapters 12 through 15, we have what might be considered then that practical application section. So he continues this pattern in his letter to the brethren at Rome, and I think the logic of this order is apparent, because a person will hardly be inclined to do something, especially if he finds it challenging for him to do it, if he does not first understand why he should do it. And so that's really what Paul does first. He shows people why they should be doing what he eventually tells them they should be doing. And this fact is, that is the fact that Paul is getting into this practical application section based upon what he has said, is evident from the fact that he begins this practical section in Romans 12 verse 1 with the word therefore, showing that what he is about to say is based on what he has just said. So this is Paul's practice. Before Paul addresses how Christians ought to live, he addresses why they ought to live that way. And so, to proceed, it should not be surprising then that Paul finds occasion in this section, that is the practical section, chapters 12 through 15, to address the Christian's relationship with the civil government. Interaction with the government, in one form or another, or to one degree or another, even on a daily basis, is virtually impossible to avoid. It seems that every aspect of our lives, particularly today in this country, falls under some regulation of either the federal or the state or the local government. The very air we breathe can be controlled and regulated by the government. The food we eat is. The cars we drive. The houses in which we live have to meet building codes. And on I could go with examples. And we would thereby be impressed with the fact that we interact with the government in one way or another, it seems like every moment of our lives. And of course, all of this can be demonstrated in the Scriptures. That is, the importance of our relationship with the governing authorities. This is illustrated by the fact, for instance, that much of Bible history, especially in the Old Testament, can be classified as what we would call political history, since most of it, or much of it, focuses on the actions of governmental leaders, kings and so forth, or judges, and how their actions, how their policies have an impact on God's people. Illustrative of this is also the fact that only 3 books in the Old Testament, Leviticus, Ruth, and Joel, I found, do not use some form of the word king or kingdom. And when we go to the New Testament, we find that only 7 out of the 27 books of the New Testament do not use some form of the word king. And so I think that shows you or demonstrates how much a part of our lives the government can, in one form or another, can affect. To proceed on from there, Jesus and his apostles, particularly Paul among them, could not avoid contact with political questions or situations in the performance of their ministries or missions. As a matter of fact, I think this is really illustrated in the second Psalm, where it is said in verses 1 and 2, "Why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed." Of course, this is talking about the part that the civil rulers, the Roman rulers, and the Jewish rulers, the part that they had in bringing about the crucifixion of the Lord, whose death, of course, is at the very center of the gospel. So, again, I think this illustrates how much involved the gospel, or those who accept the gospel, can, in one way or another, have interaction with governing authorities. And the Apostle Paul was accused of causing people to do things that were contrary to the interest of the government in a couple of places. In Acts the 17th chapter, I believe that was in Thessalonica. And then later on, he is accused of doing things that would prompt even sedition or treason against Caesar. So it was impossible, I think all of this shows, for Christians in one way or another not to interact with the government or to have contact with the government. And such contact was usually significant. Of course, beyond all of this, what the Scriptures say, we know almost intuitively or by experience the significance of the government. Government, as I said, intrudes into and regulates virtually every detail of daily life. It's arguable, as a matter of fact, that no other factor has more determinative influence on religious faith than the government under which we live, or people live. An exception to that readily comes to mind, of course, would be the home. But beyond that, surely the government has a great influence upon our people's religious faith in general. Faithfulness in ancient Israel largely rose or fell with that of its monarchs. And it is apparently no coincidence that the gospel was introduced into the world, particularly the Mediterranean world, during a time of unity, peace, and relative religious freedom imposed by the Roman government. As a matter of fact, when you looked at the Roman government, as it's represented to us in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Acts, in its ideal expressions, it was not an especially bad form of government. Furthermore, even today when we look about our world, or I don't know if I should say recent world, because some of this goes back decades, but some of us can remember when the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, existed. And were there any churches? Were there any preachers of the gospel in communistic countries at that time? Not that I knew of. They just didn't exist. Today, the same thing could be said about countries where Islamic governments dominate. How many churches, how many preachers of the gospel do you hear about in Saudi Arabia, for instance? Or even Turkey? Maybe one of the milder Islamic countries. But I'm just trying to make the point that, yes, government has a big impact, generally speaking, on people's faith and the advance of the gospel and so forth. It is probably also not without significance that it is Paul, in his letter to the brethren in Rome, who provides what is probably the lengthiest and most detailed dissertation on the role of the civil government and the Christian's proper relationship to it, here in Romans 13, 1 through 7. It was also appropriate for Paul to write this discourse, since he was both a Pharisee and a Roman citizen. I say that because Paul could look at the question of at least the Jews' relationship with the government, or the Christians' relationship with the government, because he had been on both sides. It was the Pharisees who seemed, as opposed to the Sadducees, who seemed to be the most opposed to the Roman occupation of Judea. Paul was a Pharisee. It was the Pharisees in concert with the Herodians who approached Jesus in Matthew 22, beginning with verse 15, and challenged him, tested him with a question about whether or not it was lawful to pay a poll tax to Caesar. And yet Paul, while he was a Pharisee, and you would think because he was a Pharisee, wouldn't like the Romans particularly, nevertheless was a Roman citizen. And he knew his rights as a Roman citizen and availed himself of those rights when he had occasion to do so. And of course, in many of his travels, because of his traveling in the preaching of the gospel, he became more involved with governmental officials perhaps than any other apostle. As a matter of fact, this was prophesied about him in his ministry. When the Lord appeared to him on the road to Damascus, as recorded originally in Acts the 9th chapter, confronted him and was to appoint him to be an apostle to the Gentiles. It says in verse 15, and here the Lord is speaking to Ananias, "Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel." And so he did. And furthermore, the brethren to whom Paul wrote these remarks in Romans 13 lived in the very hub and center of the political world of that day, and in the city where Paul would shortly be imprisoned, and from which he would write 5 New Testament letters: Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon, which we know as the prison epistles, those 4. But also during his second Roman imprisonment, he wrote his second letter to Timothy. So at this point, we might ask ourselves, why does Paul find it so important to call on Christians to be subject to the government? It is in the very nature of the case that most people find it a sacrifice to submit to government in its various expressions. I mean, don't you feel like you're making a sacrifice when you have to pay your taxes? In some ways, I might feel that a little bit more sharply because as a preacher, I've had to anticipate how much I would, or estimate how much I would owe in taxes in the forthcoming year and pay them on a quarterly basis. I'll be having to do that, as a matter of fact, in mid-January. And so I have to write out what is, for me, a relatively large check to the government. I feel like I'm making a sacrifice. It's not something I would naturally want to do. So life under a government is something of a trade-off, if not a paradox. We know as human beings that we need each other. We need to cooperate with each other. We need to coordinate our lives, align ourselves with one another in various efforts. But at the same time, that comes at a cost, because social cooperation also necessitates a loss of freedom and the independence that we cherish and desire. That's why I say life under government is a trade-off. Equitable and effective social interaction requires coordination, organization, leadership, and ultimately government. And yet government requires revenue in order to serve its purpose. And it requires the power to impose limitations in the form of law on everyone. I mean, we understand the necessity of law, but sometimes we wish we didn't perhaps have to obey it. We understand the necessity of law enforcement officers, but sometimes maybe when we're driving down the highway and we see a law enforcement vehicle sitting on the side of the road. You ever been inclined to go for your brake? And we might get a little bit concerned, thinking, well, does he see that I'm doing anything wrong? Am I going to see a blue light in my rearview mirror here pretty soon or something? And therefore, people do not like the taxes the government takes from them, and often because they don't sense a direct connection between what they give in taxes and the value that they get for them. I mean, when you're driving down the road or taking advantage of our infrastructure in some way, do we consciously think, well, I'm so glad I paid my taxes. I mean, I'm enjoying this road so much and driving down it. We tend not to make that connection consciously very often, do we? People like it when the government gives them something. I'm old enough to be getting some Social Security now. There was a time when I didn't get it most of my life, and I was having to pay into it, and I did not like it. Do you like to see those deductions from your paycheck? Might be decades before you see it come back to you in the form of Social Security payments. People tend to resent it, nevertheless, when the government deprives them of their money or their freedom to do what they would like to do. The Israelites demanded a king in 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter. They thought only of the benefits to be had from having someone, as they put it, we want a king so he will go out and fight our battles for us. Oh, it's just that simple. Appoint a king or have a king, and okay, then the wars will be taken care of. And Samuel pointed out, now wait just a minute. He's going to take 1/10 of all your crops. And he's going to take your young men and your young women and make them soldiers and servants. It's not quite that simple. There's a trade-off there. And as a result of all of this, something of a reluctant or grudging relationship, if not an adversarial relationship, develops between citizens and their governments. With me, it tends to come in the form of trying to beat the red light. There's about a 3 to 4 mile stretch of one highway between our home and the church building. And every time I drive that thing, I feel like I'm in competition or combat, because I'm asking myself, okay, the light up there is green. Will I be able to get through it before it turns? And will it stay yellow long enough for me to get through? And every time I drive that road, I'm struggling in a way with the government. I mean, I don't like having to stop at red lights. Logically, intellectually, I understand the importance of needing to do so, but I sure don't enjoy it. I wish I could hit every green light down that road. So sometimes, in the worst cases, people might view government at best as a necessary evil, and therefore they focus their attention on how to get as much out of their government while giving as little as they have to give. And in this process, they might resort to unethical or even criminal behavior, and they might try to rationalize that or justify it in some way. And even Christians in the first century might have been particularly susceptible to errant attitudes and behaviors toward the Roman government. Think about Jewish Christians who might have carried their old resentments and resistance toward the Roman government from their roots in Judaism. In Daniel 17, verse 15, they were told not to have any foreign king over them. They didn't even like paying taxes to that Roman government. As I've already mentioned, Jesus was challenged about that in Matthew 22, beginning with verse 15. Even Gentile Christians might have been tempted to interpret their freedom in Christ as some sort of political freedom. And for that reason, perhaps, Peter says what he says in 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter. Well, actually, let's just start with verse 13 and read this, because what he says here is very similar to what Paul says in Romans 13. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. Notice how similar that sounds to what Paul says in Romans 13, if you're familiar with Romans 13, verses 1 through 7. Proceeding, verse 15, for such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. People might think that Christians are rebels against the government in some way. Are they a threat to the government? No. A Christian living as a holy sacrifice to his God is the best citizen you could wish for, if he is living as he should. But notice verse 16 on my point especially. Act as free men, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. And he says in verse 17, honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. It's interesting that in verse 17, while I'm here, that there seems to be a narrowing of Paul's focus as we go through verse 17, from men to brethren, to God and the King, you would expect God, the reference to God, to come last, but no, the King comes last. Honor the King is what is said last. I'm not sure why Paul does that. Maybe it was to make brethren appreciate how important it is for them to honor the King. It is certainly true that unbelievers saw the references to Christ as the Christian's king, as antagonistic to the interest of the Roman emperor and state. And this point was raised in order to get Jesus by the Jews in order to get Jesus crucified. He was somehow antagonistic to the interest of Caesar. He was a competitor with Caesar, so they claimed. And of course, this same thing was brought up later on in Philippi, as recorded in Acts 16, and in Thessalonica, as recorded in Acts 17. At one point, or I should say on one point, unbelievers were certainly correct. Christians' allegiance to Caesar was not supreme. It was not absolute. It was a qualified allegiance, qualified by a greater allegiance, an absolute allegiance to God. So that the apostle said in Acts 5, verse 29, we must obey God rather than men, even at the cost of our lives. And the Roman government would eventually appreciate this and see it as a fundamental and serious threat to their agenda. And I would suggest to you that the same thing seems to be happening today. There are those in our country, many in our country, who have an agenda that they want to achieve. And they see the gospel of Jesus Christ and Christians as sitting astride that agenda and obstructing it. And a battle has been going on, and no doubt will go on. Let's look more specifically now at Romans 13. And of course, I think it would be appropriate for us just to turn over there and read the first 7 verses of that chapter. Romans 13, verses 1 through 7. Let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, he who resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath upon the one who practices evil. Therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience' sake. For because of this you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. We'll start off by looking at the context here. Paul begins this practical portion of Romans in chapter 12, verse 1, by calling on his brethren to present their bodies as a living and holy sacrifice. That call holds implications for the various facets of our lives. he points out in verses 1 through 13, has spiritual applications in our interactions with our brethren, has social applications in how we deal with our fellow human beings, has political implications, as we're looking at now in chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. Civil applications, verses 8 through 10 of that chapter. And finally, and this is as far as I will go, in the rest of chapter 13 has personal or individual applications and implications. All right, Paul's instructions on the Christian's relations to government are very closely related, we ought to note, to the immediately preceding paragraph, and I have reference specifically to verses 17 through 21 of chapter 12. This connection is evident from the fact that you'll find that some of the same ideas and words are used in both the last part of chapter 12 and the first part of chapter 13. Specifically, the word evil is used twice apiece in those chapters. The word good is used in both. Particularly the word revenge or vengeance, avenger, etymologically related. They occur in both sections. And finally, the word wrath does. As a matter of fact, in verse 19 of chapter 12, I think the connection is with first part of chapter 13 is particularly clear, because there it says, instead of taking vengeance, leave room for the wrath of God. Well, how do you leave room for the wrath of God? You do nothing? Well, yeah, you leave it, but he doesn't mean that nothing's going to be done, or that nothing should be done if you're wronged, because he goes on into chapter 13 and points out that the governor or the king or the agents of the government do not wield the sword for nothing, because it is with that sword that they wield the ability to bring wrath upon the evildoer, the criminal, the one who hurt you. So, simply put, the message to be taken from making this connection between the last paragraph of chapter 12 and our current one here at the beginning of chapter 13 is that the Christian, instead of seeking his own revenge, is to allow the government to do it for him. That is the job of the government. Now, there is a wider context which is helpful to note for a better understanding of the New Testament teaching on this subject. We need to bear in mind that when we talk about context, it's arguable that the greatest context with which we should concern ourselves is not just the immediate context of a passage. It is that any passage in the Bible lies within the context of the whole Bible. That's just another way of saying that we need to take into account any other relevant passages in the Scriptures when we're on a particular passage, when we're considering what that passage teaches. And we appreciate then the fact that what Paul has to say might make a little bit clearer what Jesus means when he refers to turning the other cheek in Matthew 5, verses 38 through 42. Of course, that's hyperbole, an exaggeration for effect or for emphasis. And Jesus there is pointing out, don't retaliate. When you are personally abused, don't lash out, or when you feel that you are offended, don't lash out and retaliate on your own as an individual. Rather, if you are wronged, either you accept that, or if necessary, you would, and this is where Paul comes in, you would appeal to the government for a redress of your grievances. So both texts, that is Romans 13 and Matthew 5, oppose the idea of the individual getting even, trying to make his own justice, take the law into his own hands, as is perhaps commonly said. An example of this very sort of thing, a biblical example, is that of Moses. In Acts 7, verse 24, it mentions that he killed a man in order to take vengeance for the oppressed. And of course, that got him into trouble. And as we've seen also from reading 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17, Peter, who was probably familiar with Paul's letter to the Romans, judging from what he says about Paul in his letters in 2 Peter 3, 15 and 16, virtually quotes from Romans 13 when he writes on the Christian's duty to the government. I'm just pointing out that there are other passages that are related to what Paul says here in Romans 13. Paul's instructions regarding the Christian's relationship to the government may be summarized in 4 obligations. And the first of these, perhaps the most extensive, is that of submission or obedience, as Titus puts it in Titus 3, verses 1 and 2. Paul ultimately cites 2 reasons for such submission, and they're specified in verse 5. To put them in other words, you need to be obedient, submissive to the government, because if you're not, you're going to be punished for breaking the law. But Paul in verse 5 says, do it also for conscience sake, which is another way of saying you need to fear being punished by God also. That's another way of simply put, of saying it's a sin. It's a sin. It's contrary to God's will, God's commandment to disobey the government, if in doing so you do not violate His will as expressed in His Word. So we have that as an obligation to submit to the government and its various laws. So, though Paul says that Christians should be subject to governmental authorities out of fear of punishment for violating the law, the primary reason he cites for such submission is the punishment that God will impose on Christians for not being submissive. He points out in verse 1 that God ordained that people should live under governments. God did not ordain any specific kind of government. As a matter of fact, when Paul wrote these words, he was not living in a democracy. Sometimes we take it for granted that no government is legitimate unless it's a democratic government. That democratic governments, as we know them today anyway, are relatively recent. God did not ordain any specific kind of government, particularly a democracy. Though this is not to say that Paul could not have had in mind the fact that God can raise up particular men to rulership for the fulfillment of His purposes, because He certainly did. Perhaps an outstanding Old Testament example is that of Cyrus, the king of the Persians, who is called God's servant because God used him to implement His purpose. Now, this is not to say that God approves of everything every government does, any more than that, though He ordained the family, He ordained the church, the local church. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that He approves of everything each family or each father or mother does, or what each local church does, or what the elders of each church does. But in principle, this is God's arrangement, though sometimes it may not be well implemented. Government officials are servants of God. Paul says that twice in verses 4 and 6 of our passage. Now, we need to bear in mind that Paul is positing or setting forth the ideal case when he says that rulers are not a cause, a fear for good behavior, but for evil behavior. That is the ideal case. Although sometimes there are rulers who are a cause of fear for good behavior. But Paul is setting forth the ideal, what should be the case. Government performs a very important role for Christians. And thus the first and foremost, and it seems like Paul is saying the sole purpose of government is to provide for safety and peace and security so that Christians may live and serve their God in such a state. I'm reminded as I say that of what Paul said in 1 Timothy, the 2nd chapter, when he says specifically, "First of all, then, I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men, for kings, and for all who are in authority, in order that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity." Yes, when we have wars, when we have civil disruptions and disorder in our society, that really takes away people's attention from the gospel of Jesus Christ and inhibits our ability to get people's attention and to teach them. So we need to pray that we would have the kind of government that would ensure that we could live in safety and security, that we would have peace and tranquility, so that we might be able to carry on as Christians should. Now, the government serves its purpose by threatening punishment to those who do wrong. And when it fails in that task, it fails in its primary duty to the citizens whom it is to serve. Reference is made to the sword, famously in this chapter. It is a symbol of the government's authority to inflict punishment upon criminals. I do not say that it refers exclusively to the death penalty, but it certainly includes the death penalty because the sword is to be used as a form of punishment upon the wrongdoer. That doesn't mean spanking him with the flat of the sword. I emphasize that because on more than one occasion, I've had to deal with brethren or converse with them, interact with them, have exchanges with them on the very subject of whether or not capital punishment is right. We need to bear in mind that the one, I might say, who invented capital punishment was God Himself in Genesis 9, verses 5 and 6. He who sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. He doesn't say there, note, that I'll shed the blood of the murderer. He says, by man his blood shall be shed. He gives us the responsibility of ensuring that people respect life by assuring that if they are so dastardly, so contemptuous of human life, that they would stoop to take it, that therefore their lives, they will be apprehended, they will be tried, they will be convicted, and they will be punished. Their lives will be taken for doing something like that. Since this role of government agents is of a moral nature, and yet it is said to be for good, to use Paul's phrase in Romans, even if it might not be advisable for the Christian to step into that role, it is difficult to see how it would be wrong for him to do so, since Paul says what the government does and the proper performance of its God-given duty is good. And I can't see how it would be bad or evil for the Christian to do what God says is good. I do not encourage Christians to become police officers or particularly to get into the military. That's not my point. As a matter of fact, for various reasons, it could be inadvisable. But neither do I think that is wrong, and perhaps that's enough said on that point. Governments generally do not trouble law-abiding citizens who work industriously and mind their own business and do their work quietly, as Paul says we should do in 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 11. And let's bear in mind that all of this is said by one who had suffered immensely at the hands of the exceptions. When I say exceptions, I'm talking about the exceptions in government to acting for the good of whether Paul or any other Christian or citizens in general. Paul talks about having been beaten so many times. Let me just not trust my memory about the number of times, but just turn over to 2 Corinthians 11, verses 23 through 25. And this is what Paul, and this is part of what makes what he says in Romans 13, 1 through 7 so impressive. Because of his sufferings at the hands of governmental agents. Beginning with verse 23 of 2 Corinthians 11, we note that it says, "Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane. I more so, in far more labors, in far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death, 5 times." And this is probably undoubtedly a reference to what governmental agents have inflicted upon him. Verse 24, 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times, this is probably from Roman authorities or Gentile authorities, 3 times I was beaten with rods. I've never come anywhere close to suffering anything like that at the hands of government. But Paul did. And yet he still writes in Romans 13 and says the government is a servant of God. It's ordained by God. You need to obey it. Be submissive to it. Christians, when they're acting as Christians should, present no threats of rebellion against governments, not liking government or its policies, as in the case of paying taxes that we might resent, in the case of obeying traffic ordinances, in the case of observing what the law has to say about immigration into this country. Not liking the government or its policies is no excuse for disobedience. Just after Peter said what he had to say in 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17 about submission to the government, he goes on to talk about the slave's relationship to his master, and he says, and I don't think it's simply coincidental that he has this to say right after what he says about the Christian's obligation to obey the government. He goes on to say, even in the case of masters who are unreasonable, still you need to be submissive to them. It's a temptation perhaps to think, I shouldn't have to pay these taxes. Look what my tax money's going to. And under that thinking, we might be tempted then to cut corners that we shouldn't be cutting. Some people think that, to make my remarks here at this point very relevant, some people might think, well, we should have a different immigration policy. It's just not fair to people on the other side of the border. Maybe so. I don't know. Maybe we should be letting more people in. That does not justify the breaking of the law. This hits home with me because in New Jersey, it was not unusual to have Christians from other countries present themselves to us and maybe not be in the country legally. And this was troubling to me, especially when I first arrived. It happened so often that, as my coworker put it, eventually we got to the point where we practiced don't ask, don't tell. And I feel bad about that now, looking back on it. I can't say that I absolutely knew that any of the other members were here in this country illegally at the time they were members of the church to which I preached. But in some cases, I very strongly suspected that. And in some cases in other churches, evidently that's known and ignored. I have difficulty with that because sometimes it's not just a matter of entering the country illegally, but entering it by lying about it and letting that lie stand. And I have great difficulty understanding how a faithful Christian could present himself as a faithful Christian and continue in a lie and take advantage of the lie that he told. So perhaps that is something brethren need to take a closer look at. Christians are not justified in taking up the sword in rebellion against a government, particularly in defense of their faith. Jesus told Peter, "Put up your sword." Jesus told Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world, for if my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting, that I might not be delivered up to the Jews." Paul said in 2 Corinthians 10, and likewise in Ephesians 6, that the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh. Of course, all of this is shown by the fact that Paul did not counsel rebellion against the Roman government, though it was or was capable of being an evil one. Well, now the last three will go quickly. He also says in verses 6 and 7 that we're obligated to pay taxes. So in addition to being submissive to the government, we're obligated to pay taxes. This and the next two obligations, which Paul says the Christian owes to his government, are expressions of this submission that he requires. The payment of taxes fulfills an obligation the government, or rather the Christian owes government for the service that government renders to him. For Paul says he is devoted, that is, the governmental agent is devoted to this service. I won't break down or enumerate the difference between taxes and customs. It is apparently the case that tax refers to a direct tax, and the other, customs, refers to import and export duties, or this word might be strange to it, might refer to something called tariffs. And third, Paul says we owe the government, we're obligated to the government, to fear the government. That is, respect it. Fear refers to the awe in which one holds a governmental official because of the office he holds, not because of his character, but because of the office he holds. And thus, this fear is not just a contrived outward respect the Christian expresses toward government, and its officers and agents, but a genuine inward private reverence. Fourth and last, he says, and I will make a distinction here. We got these two couplets, taxes and customs, and then fear and honor. And it seems like they are synonyms. But we can make a distinction between fear and honor that we could not so easily make, or I cannot so easily make, between taxes and customs. So fear, or rather honor, I should say, it extends beyond the fear just mentioned. Its outward verbal expression. Though Christians are free to exercise their democratic right to dissent and protest, this does not extend to civil disorder, civil disobedience, does not extend to expressions of disrespect, verbal or otherwise. It does not extend to ridicule, contempt, hatred. We are to honor the government. Perhaps I can get away with saying I did not especially appreciate the last administration, but I also found it to be very wrong, the disrespect that was shown to the president in various ways, ridiculing him. No. Paul calls upon us instead to honor the government or its specific officials and agents. One time, Paul was accused of expressing disrespect for speaking evil of God's high priest. Paul said, I didn't realize he was a high priest, because, and he quoted from Exodus 22, verse 28. He said, you shall not speak evil of or curse the ruler of your people. No, you have to show them respect. Okay, thank you for being so patient. Perhaps I've gone a little bit over time, but if you have a complaint about that, take it up with Byron. Just summarizing now, Paul shows that a Christian presents his body as a living and holy sacrifice as he overcomes his impulse to inflict evil on others for the evil they might do to him, but instead leaves it to the government to seek vengeance. Which, by the way, vengeance is not wrong per se. Vengeance is another word for justice, in the Greek anyway. I should say there are different English words for the same that translate the same Greek word. I refer to the English words justice and vengeance. Vengeance is justice when done in the hands of the government. Indeed, summarizing again here, more than this, Christians owe government authorities submission, such as expressed in obedience, in payment of taxes, in holding them in respect, and then finally, in giving them honor. It might be that there is someone here tonight, by virtue of something I have said, that has encouraged such a reaction, or perhaps by virtue of something that has happened in his or her life, or something someone else has said, desires to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. Isn't it wonderful to be a Christian? I said a while ago that the best citizens a government could wish for would be Christians. If you become a Christian, you become a part of a group of people who are the best, potentially and ideally, that the world has. The best group. Wouldn't you like to be one of those? If you're not, come forward in faith and in repentance to confess your faith in Christ, and then be baptized in a body of water that the blood of Christ might cleanse you of your sins. If you've done that, but since then have drifted away, perhaps having forgot what it really meant to be a Christian, and would like to make things right with God and His people by confession of your sins here tonight, If that's your need, your desire, we'd like to help you. Won't you come forward and let it be known as together for your encouragement, we now stand and sing.
So glad you took the time to study with us. If this lesson encouraged you, please like, comment, and share the video to help more people find God's Word. Thanks for watching.